The blazing Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Violet Ridgeway as she made her way down the dusty main street of Copper Creek, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly while the other clutched a basket of supplies. It had been 3 months since she had buried her husband, Matthew, after a mining accident took his life, leaving her alone to raise their unborn child in this unforgiving frontier town. The summer of 1876 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures soaring to unbearable heights. Violet had pushed herself too hard today, determined to stock up on provisions before her confinement began. At 7 months pregnant, she knew she shouldn't be venturing out in such heat, but necessity had driven her from her modest cabin on the edge of town. The world suddenly began to swim before her eyes. The street, lined with wooden storefronts and hitching posts, seemed to tilt and waver. She felt a rush of heat followed by an alarming coldness washing over her. The basket slipped from her fingers, scattering potatoes and canned goods across the dirt road as her knees buckled beneath her. As darkness closed in around the edges of her vision, Violet was vaguely aware of a commotion nearby, the sound of boots hitting wooden planks at her run, and someone shouting. Just as consciousness began to slip away, she felt strong arms encircle her, catching her mere inches from the ground. "I've got you, madam," came a deep, steady voice, and it was the last thing she heard before the world went black. When Violet opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a leather sofa in an unfamiliar office. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, stirring the hot air. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed against her shoulder. "Easy there," said the same deep voice she'd heard just before fainting. "You gave half the town quite a fright." Violet blinked, her vision clearing to reveal a man kneeling beside her. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-bronzed skin and kind blue eyes that stood out against his weathered face. Dark blonde hair fell across his forehead, and he pushed it back with a work-roughened hand. "Where am I?" she asked, her throat dry as desert sand. "Sheriff's office," he replied, offering her a glass of water. "I'm Brandon Eastwood, deputy sheriff. Folks call me Bran." Violet accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips. "Thank you, Deputy Eastwood. I don't know what came over me." "I reckon it was the heat and your condition," he said, his gaze briefly falling to her rounded belly. "It's no day for a lady in your circumstances to be out and about." A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. "I didn't have much choice. My supplies were running low, and she stopped abruptly, suddenly remembering her basket. "My groceries." "Don't you worry about that," Brandon assured her with a smile that softened his features. "Mrs. Peterson from the general store gathered everything up. She's holding them for you." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by concern about the cost of replacing anything that might have been damaged. Money was tight, and every penny counted now that she was alone. "You're the Ridgeway widow, aren't you?" Brandon asked gently. "From up on Cottonwood Road." Violet nodded, the word widow still feeling like a knife to her heart. "Yes, Violet Ridgeway. My husband Matthew passed 3 months ago." Brandon's expression grew solemn. "I remember, that mine collapse was a terrible business. I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Mrs. Ridgeway." "Thank you," she said softly, attempting to sit up again. This time he helped her, his hand steady at her back. "You should rest a while longer before heading home," he advised. "Sheriff Ellis is out on patrol, but he won't mind you using his office to recover." Looking around, Violet noticed the sparse but tidy room, with wanted posters tacked to one wall and a gun rack behind a solid wooden desk. "I appreciate your kindness, but I should get back. I have chickens to feed and, if you'll pardon my boldness, madam," Brandon interrupted, "I don't think you ought to be walking all the way home in your condition, especially after fainting. I'd be happy to drive you in my wagon when you're feeling steadier." Violet wanted to protest, to insist she could manage on her own as she had been doing since Matthew's death, but practicality won out. The walk home was nearly a mile, uphill for most of it, and the afternoon heat showed no signs of abating. "That's very kind of you, Deputy," she finally conceded. "I would be grateful for the ride." While she rested, Brandon brought her a cool cloth for her forehead and tended to the day's business, occasionally checking on her between tasks. Violet observed him discreetly as he worked, noting the way he treated each person who came into the office with respect, whether it was the banker in his fine suit or a dusty prospector with a complaint about claim jumpers. An hour later, as the worst of the day's heat began to wane, Brandon helped Violet into his wagon after retrieving her supplies from Mrs. Peterson. The older woman had added a jar of preserves for strength, refusing to accept payment despite Violet's protests. As they rode toward her cabin, the wagon wheels stirring up dust along the rutted road, Violet found herself studying the deputy more closely. His shoulders were broad beneath his cotton shirt, his forearms tanned and strong as he handled the reins. There was a quietness about him that she found comforting, so different from the boisterous energy that had characterized her late husband. "Have you been in Copper Creek long, Deputy Eastwood?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. "Going on 5 years now," he replied. "Came west after the war between the states, needed open skies after too much time in Virginia trenches." Violet nodded, understanding. Matthew came west for similar reasons, said the Pennsylvania coal mines reminded him too much of the tunnels at Petersburg. Brandon glanced at her with newfound respect. "Your husband was a Union man." "Yes, 147th Pennsylvania." He spoke highly of the Southern soldiers' bravery, though. The deputy's expression softened. "It was a terrible time, men on both sides just trying to survive." He paused, then added, "I was with the 12th Virginia. Seems strange now, thinking about how we might have been shooting at each other back then." They fell silent again, each contemplating the twists of fate that had brought them to this place and time. As they rounded the bend that led to her cabin, Violet felt a curious reluctance for the journey to end. The cabin came into view, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs with a small porch and a vegetable garden to one side. It wasn't much, but it was hers, free and clear. Matthew had insisted on paying off their land before taking the dangerous mining job that eventually claimed his life. Brandon pulled the wagon to a stop and quickly came around to help her down. His hands at her waist were strong and steady, and for just a moment, Violet allowed herself to lean on someone else's strength. "Thank you again, Deputy," she said, stepping back quickly, aware of the impropriety of a pregnant widow accepting too much assistance from an unmarried man. Small towns had long memories and longer tongues. "Brandon," he corrected gently, "or Bran if you prefer, no need for formalities." Violet hesitated, then nodded. "Brandon, then, I'm in your debt." He shook his head as he began unloading her supplies. "No debt at all. Just doing what any decent fellow would. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." She moved to take the basket from him, but he insisted on carrying everything inside. The cabin's interior was simple but meticulously kept, with a small sitting area dominated by a stone fireplace, a kitchen space with an iron stove, and doors leading to what Brandon presumed were bedrooms. A half-finished baby cradle sat in one corner, the tools beside it suggesting Matthew had been working on it before his death. Brandon's gaze lingered on it for a moment before he turned away, respecting her privacy. He set the supplies on her kitchen table, then stepped back toward the door. "If you're certain you'll be all right, Mrs. Ridgeway, I should get back to town." "Violet," she said softly, "if I'm to call you Brandon, then fair's fair." A smile touched his lips. "Violet it is then. If you need anything, you send word to town. There's plenty of folks who'd be happy to help, myself included." She saw him to the door, watching as he climbed back onto his wagon. With a tip of his hat, he turned the horses and headed back toward town, leaving Violet with an unexpected feeling of loss as she stood on her porch watching until he disappeared from view. The next few weeks brought Brandon to Violet's cabin several times. First, it was to check on her welfare, bringing a letter that had arrived for her at the town's post office. Then, noticing her woodpile running low, he spent a Sunday afternoon splitting logs for her winter supply, refusing payment beyond a glass of lemonade and a slice of apple pie. On each visit, they talked a little more. She learned he'd come from a Virginia farming family, had lost both his parents and younger brother to the war or its aftermath, and had drifted west seeking a place where the divisions of North and South meant less. He discovered her Pennsylvania roots, her love of books, and how she'd met Matthew at a church social back east before following him to Arizona territory. It was during his fourth visit, while repairing a loose shutter on her bedroom window, that Brandon first felt the baby kick. Violet had been standing beside him, holding nails, when she gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her side. "Are you all right?" he asked, alarmed. "Yes," she laughed, the sound bright in the afternoon quiet. "This little one has decided to practice his kicking." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it against her belly. The moment his palm touched the rounded firmness, the baby kicked again, and Brandon's eyes widened in wonder. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, his hand against her, connected by the miracle of new life stirring beneath her skin. Then, as if suddenly aware of their impropriety, they both stepped back, Violet blushing furiously and Brandon clearing his throat as he turned back to the shutter with renewed concentration. "Sorry," Violet murmured. "That was terribly forward of me." Brandon shook his head, his voice gruff with emotion. "No need to apologize. It's remarkable." They finished the repairs in silence, but something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge spanning the gap of their separate griefs. As August turned to September, Violet's time grew nearer. The women of Copper Creek, led by Mrs. Peterson and the midwife, Mrs. Hollister, began checking on her regularly. Brandon kept his distance during this time, conscious of appearances, but sent occasional notes with travelers heading her way, asking after her health. It was the first week of October, with autumn painting the cottonwoods gold along the creek, when Violet's labor began. Mrs. Hollister had come to stay with her for the final week of her confinement, and it was she who sent the young Carson boy racing to town with news that the baby was coming early. Brandon received the message while on patrol and immediately headed for the cabin, arriving just as a thunderstorm broke over the mountains. Rain lashed the windows as Mrs. Hollister met him at the door, her expression grave. "It's a difficult birth, Deputy," she said quietly. "Baby's turned wrong. I've sent for Doc Miller, but he's out at the Harper Ranch delivering twins." Inside, he could hear Violet's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain. His heart clenched at the sound. "What can I do?" he asked, removing his dripping hat. "Pray," the midwife said simply. "And keep water boiling. This may be a long night." Hours passed, the storm raging outside while another kind of tempest raged within. Brandon paced the small cabin, feeding the fire, boiling water, and trying not to think about how many women died in childbirth, especially in remote places like this, far from proper medical care. Around midnight, Violet's cries became more urgent and Mrs. Hollister called for him. "I need another pair of hands," she explained. "The baby's coming now, but it's breech. I need you to help hold her." Brandon had never felt more terrified or more determined as he entered the bedroom. Violet lay pale and exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes wild with pain and fear. When she saw him, she reached out instinctively. "Brandon," she gasped, as another contraction seized her. He took her hand without hesitation. "I'm here, Violet. You're going to be fine, both of you." For the next hour, he supported her as she labored, holding her upright when Mrs. Hollister needed her positioned differently, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement. When she thought she couldn't push anymore, he looked into her eyes and told her she was the strongest woman he'd ever known. Just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a baby's cry pierced the exhausted silence of the room. "A girl," Mrs. Hollister announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant. "A beautiful little girl." Tears streamed down Violet's face as the midwife placed the tiny bundle in her arms. Brandon stood back, overcome by the moment, watching as mother and daughter met for the first time. "Matthew would have been so proud," Violet whispered, tracing a finger down her daughter's cheek. "He would," Brandon agreed softly. Then, knowing his presence was no longer needed, he quietly left the room to give them privacy in this sacred moment. He was dozing in a chair by the fire when Mrs. Hollister emerged some time later. "Both mother and child are resting now," she told him. "It was touch and go for a while, but they're fighters." Brandon nodded, relief washing over him. "What will you name her?" he asked when Violet was strong enough to receive visitors the following day. She smiled tiredly from her bed, the baby sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside her, the same cradle Matthew had started, which Brandon had quietly completed during the past month. "Eleanor," she said. "After my mother, Eleanor Grace Ridgeway." Brandon moved to the cradle, looking down at the tiny face framed by wisps of dark hair. "It suits her," he said. "She's perfect, Violet." "She is," Violet agreed, then added hesitantly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did." He shook his head. "I did nothing worth thanking." "You were here," she said simply. "When I was most afraid, you were here. That means everything." Their eyes met across the small room, and Brandon felt something shift in his heart, like a key turning in a long, locked door, but it wasn't the time, not yet. She was still recovering, still mourning, still learning to be a mother, so he simply nodded and promised to check on them both soon. The weeks after Eleanor's birth brought a new routine to Violet's life, days and nights defined by feedings and diaper changes, stolen moments of sleep, and the indescribable joy of watching her daughter grow. Brandon continued his visits, now bringing small gifts for the baby: a hand-carved wooden rattle, a soft blanket purchased from a traveling peddler, a silver teething ring that had been his mother's. As winter settled over Copper Creek, bringing snow to the higher elevations and crisp, clear days to the valley, Brandon found more and more reasons to ride out to the cabin. He repaired loose boards on the porch, restocked the woodpile, and often brought extra provisions from town, things Violet hadn't asked for but clearly needed. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Whispers began about the handsome deputy and the young widow. Some thought it scandalous that he visited so frequently, while others, like Mrs. Peterson, declared it about time that poor girl had some happiness again. Brandon ignored the gossip, but he couldn't ignore the growing feelings in his heart. Each visit made it clearer that Violet and Eleanor had become the center of his world. He found himself thinking of them during quiet moments at work, wondering if the baby was sleeping through the night yet, if Violet was getting enough rest, if they were warm enough as the winter deepened. It was Christmas Eve when things finally changed between them. Brandon arrived at the cabin with a small fir tree tied to his saddle, determined that Eleanor's first Christmas should have at least some of the traditional trimmings, modest though they might be. Violet opened the door with Eleanor in her arms, her face lighting up at the sight of the tree. "You didn't have to do that," she said, but her smile told him she was pleased. "Every child deserves a Christmas tree," he replied, stomping snow from his boots before entering. "Even if she's too young to remember it." Together, they set up the tree in the corner of the sitting room, using candles and paper stars Violet quickly fashioned from old letters as decorations. Eleanor watched from her cradle, big eyes following their movements, occasionally cooing or waving her tiny fists. After a simple dinner, they sat before the fire, the room illuminated only by its glow and the candles on the tree. Eleanor had fallen asleep, leaving them in a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "I have something for you," Brandon said suddenly, reaching into his coat pocket. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Violet opened it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Oh, Brandon," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty. "It's beautiful." "I thought maybe you could put a lock of Eleanor's hair in it," he suggested, "to keep her close to your heart." Violet looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Would you help me put it on?" she turned, lifting her hair as Brandon fastened the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, and he felt her slight shiver at the contact. When she turned back to face him, she was so close he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "I have something for you too," she said softly, "though it's not wrapped." From beside her chair, she retrieved a book, a well-worn collection of Wordsworth's poetry. "It was my father's," she explained. "You mentioned once that you enjoyed poetry but had few books out here. I thought you might like this." Brandon accepted the gift reverently, understanding the significance of her parting with something so personal. "Violet, I can't take this." "It's a family heirloom, and you've become family to us," she said simply. "You've done so much for Eleanor and me, more than I could ever repay." "I never wanted repayment," he said, his voice low with emotion. "I know." She hesitated, then added, The truth is, Brandon, I look forward to your visits more than I should. When you're not here, I find myself watching the road, hoping to see you coming. That's not proper for a widow not yet a year into her mourning. Brandon set the book aside and took her hands in his. Proper or not, I feel the same. I think about you and Alina all the time. I worry when I can't check on you. He paused, gathering courage. I care for you both more than I thought possible. Tears welled in Violet's eyes. I feel so guilty sometimes. Matthew hasn't been gone a year and already my heart. She couldn't finish. Matthew loved you, Brandon said gently. He'd want you to be happy, to be cared for. I believe that with all my heart. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. In the momentary brightness, Brandon saw the conflict in Violet's eyes, grief and hope, fear and longing, all warring for dominance. I'm not asking for anything right now, he assured her. Just the chance to keep visiting, to watch Alina grow, to be here for you both. Time will tell us what's right. Relief softened her features. I'd like that, she whispered. Very much. On an impulse, Brandon leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was a chaste gesture, respectful of her mourning, yet filled with promise for the future. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing season came a change in Violet as well. The weight of grief, while never entirely absent, began to lift, allowing space for joy to return. Alina thrived, growing from a tiny, helpless newborn to a chubby, smiling baby who recognized Brandon's voice and reached for him whenever he visited. By summer, those visits had become an established part of their lives. Brandon often rode out after his shift ended, staying for dinner and sometimes reading to Alina before she fell asleep. On his days off, he might spend the whole day at the cabin, helping with repairs or simply enjoying their company. The town's gossip had largely died down, replaced by a general acceptance of the relationship forming between the deputy and the widow. Sheriff Ellis even teased Brandon occasionally about that pretty widow up on Cottonwood Road turning you domestic. It was a warm evening in late July when Brandon finally found the courage to speak his heart fully. They were sitting on Violet's porch, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass as Alina slept inside. The air was sweet with the scent of wild roses that climbed along one side of the cabin, planted by Violet that spring in what she called an act of faith in the future. Do you ever think about leaving Copper Creek? Brandon asked suddenly. Violet looked at him in surprise. Leaving? No, not really. This is our home now. Why do you ask? Brandon shifted in his chair, suddenly nervous. I've been offered a job, sheriff of a town called Willow Springs, about 50 miles north of here. It's a good position, better pay, a house included. It's a growing town with a real school and even a small library. Oh, Violet's voice was carefully neutral. That sounds like a fine opportunity. When would you go? That depends, he said, turning to face her directly, on whether I'd be going alone. Violet's breath caught as understanding dawned. Brandon. He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. Violet, I've loved you for longer than I should admit. I've loved Alina as if she were my own from the moment I heard her first cry. I know it's been just a year since Matthew passed, and if you need more time, I'll wait. But I wanted you to know that when I imagine my future, I see you both in it. Tears filled Violet's eyes, but they were different from the tears of grief he'd seen so often in the early days of their acquaintance. Are you asking me to marry you? She whispered. I am, he confirmed. I'm asking you to be my wife, to let me be a father to Alina, to build a new life together in Willow Springs or here, if you prefer. Wherever you are is home to me now. For a long moment, Violet was silent, and Brandon feared he'd spoken too soon, pushed too hard. Then she squeezed his hands. Matthew will always have a place in my heart, she said softly. He gave me Alina, and for that I'll be eternally grateful, but my heart is big enough for new love too. I realized that months ago, watching you rock Alina to sleep, seeing the way you look at her at us. Hope bloomed in Brandon's chest. Is that a yes? Instead of answering directly, Violet leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a sweet, tentative kiss, their first real kiss. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. Yes, she said simply. Yes to being your wife, yes to Willow Springs, yes to our future together. Brandon gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world because to him she was. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the town church, with Alina dressed in a tiny white gown made from Violet's wedding dress. Mrs. Peterson cried, Sheriff Ellis served as best man, and Mrs. Hollister held Alina during the exchange of vows. As summer turned to fall, the new family prepared for their move to Willow Springs. The cabin where Violet had known both her deepest grief and the beginning of her new happiness was sold to a young couple just arrived from back east, looking to start their own frontier story. On their last night in Copper Creek, Brandon and Violet stood on the porch one final time, Alina sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder. The same stars that had witnessed their growing love now oversaw its fulfillment. "Are you sad to be leaving?" Brandon asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Violet considered the question, looking out at the land that had been her home through so much change. "No," she finally said. "I'm taking everything that matters with me." She glanced down at Alina, then up at her husband. "Matthew brought me west to find a new life. I think he'd be pleased to know that I found happiness here, even if it's different from what we planned." Brandon kissed her temple gently. "We'll visit his grave before we go tomorrow. Alina should know where her father rests." Violet nodded, grateful once again for this man's understanding heart. "And then we'll look forward, not back." "Forward," Brandon agreed, "to Willow Springs, to growing our family, to all the years ahead." As if sensing she was being discussed, Alina stirred in her mother's arms, blinking up at them both before settling back to sleep with a contented sigh. The following morning, they loaded their wagon with their belongings and set out on the road north, leaving Copper Creek behind but carrying its lessons with them. As they crested the hill that would take the town from view, Violet turned to look back one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was addressing the town, Matthew's memory, or God himself, perhaps all three. Then she faced forward again, toward Willow Springs and the future, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest loves are born from the deepest sorrows, and that life, like the frontier itself, offered second chances to those brave enough to take them. At her side, Brandon guided the horses with steady hands, occasionally glancing at his new family with wonder and gratitude. 3 hearts beating as one, they moved forward into the promise of tomorrow, leaving behind the echoes of a fateful day when a pregnant widow had fainted in the street, and a cowboy had caught her before she touched the ground, changing both their lives forever.